I, I believe I'm in the right place. The first question if I am, the first question I have is from Vladislav, and is Vladislav here with us today? Am I looking at the right set of questions?
Yes.
Paul, am I looking at the right questions?
Yes, you are.
I am. Okay. So, all right. Vladislav is not here. So Harpreet.
That's me. Hello.
Hi. Hello. Okay.
It's a good evening here. I'm signing in from Abu Dhabi.
Abu Dhabi. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
It's morning here. So morning here, evening there. Yes.
Yeah.
Oops. Okay. So you ask, what is prayer and how does it work? Can we pray for someone who passed away? And would prayers benefit them? And so this is an interesting question. We ask ourselves what prayer is. And of course, the way we answer that will be predicated upon a lot of other beliefs that we have and the culture that we're a part of and so forth. But if the way that I think about it is that prayer is, it's a very positive activity for an individual mind to engage in. It is like doing loving kindness and compassion and the other Brahma-Vihara meditations. It is generating a state of mind that is characterized by loving kindness and compassion, amongst other things. Now that, of course, is beneficial to one who prays, because it is, well, I was about to say, because prayer is a selfless act. Of course, we can also pray selfishly as well. But setting that aside, the kind of prayer that I think that you're asking about is essentially a selfless act, and it is done out of the wish for some kind of benefit for another. So now, in a personal metaphysics that I have developed as a result of my practice and everything, this actually is very consistent with a lot of traditional Buddhism. And if you're familiar with the Yogacara school of Buddhism, you'll probably understand better where I'm coming from this. But what we perceive as our individual minds are really not separate from other minds or just mind in general. And we have to be careful here because, remembering that whether the concept of mind is individual or made somehow cosmic, it's still a mental formation, okay? But we'll keep those caveats in mind. So when we pray, or when we wish well for somebody else, can it have an effect beyond ourselves? And I am quite convinced that it can, not just as a result of thinking and beliefs and wanting it to be so, but I have had many experiences that tend to confirm this interconnectedness of all that we call mind. So let me go back to the wording of your question, and then you can clarify for me. So how does it work? To the degree that, well, the way I think of it is you're putting out something very positive into the totality of suchness, whatever, however you want to think of it. And so that becomes available. So how it works is that you are actually generating something positive, and it becomes a part of this much greater wholeness that we are part of, that we are all participating in. Okay. Can we pray for someone who passed away? Of course we can. Would prayers benefit them? Now here we come to something. Who is this them that it might benefit? Because after all, before the process that was their mind and body began to dissolve, what there was a process. And because of certain aspects of causal continuity, and because our minds are geared this way, we identified a them, a him, a her, a person. And likewise, they did the same for themselves, but it's really an ongoing process. With the dissolution of the body and the mind at death, nothing is gone, but the process has taken a different form. But as I said before, the prayer is still going to be of benefit to the whole. And no matter what form, that sort of nexus, that coming together of various causal influences that we would have pointed to and said, that is such and such a person, that is all a part of this wholeness, and it is going to benefit that wholeness, and it is going to benefit both the process arising that we would have identified as that person, and whatever arises from what that process, how that process participated in the much larger process. Am I getting too far off for you, or is this making sense? There's this whole part of it.
Okay, I understand this. I was actually referring to my husband who passed away recently, and that was very sudden. And I didn't know how to send some kind of love or, something to him, because I grew up believing we pray to God, and I never believed in that concept. So I was thinking, if I just send him some kind of loving kindness, would it really meet him, and would he benefit out of that? And would his state, wherever he is, be okay? Would it make any change or any benefit to him? That's where I was actually coming from.
Yes, it's going to benefit. It's going to benefit him in the sense that, as I said, that we make a projection, but it's going to benefit. It's going to be of benefit to everything and everyone everywhere, beginning with yourself, and that definitely includes him, right? So prayer is most definitely worthwhile, and please do feel free to don't question the value of your prayer, because it's quite wonderful.
And the technique to prayer, would this be similar to how we do the loving kindness meditation?
Yes, if I were going to pray, I would do it very much in the way that I described doing the loving kindness meditation. But that's not saying that that's the only or the best way to pray. Somebody else might pray to God and ask God to bestow some benefits on an individual. But the closest counterpart that we have to God in our way of thinking is this is this wholeness of everything, this suchness, the ultimate reality that we are a part of. And so to pray to God is really to pray to that. So just no matter what people are doing, if there's goodness in their heart, if there is a selfless wish for benefit for an individual or for others, then it is a profoundly valuable act. And
thank you. That helps me a lot. Thank you.
You are quite welcome. We had another couple of questions here. As you asked about okay. I'm not sure what happened there. So you're asking about the two books that I mentioned that I'm working on. I can't say when they'll be released, but when I am released from the current things that I'm working on, then much more time and energy will go into them, and they will be released more quickly. And what I've been working on is pretty much winding up into, yeah, that's coming to an end, and I'll be able to share all of that with all of you, hopefully in the not too distant future. Is there a new batch of online course starting anytime soon? That's very much an open question. You know, I have limited time and energy left, and that could change very rapidly at any time. There's many different factors that I've had to weigh, and I haven't come to a decision of what form my teaching in the future will take. Quite honestly, I went through a period of great disillusionment. I looked at people that had been students of mine for a very, very long time and who were close to me, and I thought had learned and understood much. And the disappointment that I felt in them was so great that I went through a period of thinking, I've been wasting my time for years. Why should I go back to this? But then I had other people come to me who obviously had gained much and understood clearly, and that has shifted my thinking. So I'm sorry I can't give you a definitive answer to that question at this time. I feel like I have a lot more that I would like to offer, but I have many other things to take into consideration.
Yeah, and I totally understand. Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
You're most welcome. Let's see. So the next question, by the way, I want to check to see if Vladislav has arrived since we skipped his question. Vlad, are you here yet? No. Okay, good. I mean, it's not good, but it's clear. Okay. Santiago. You asked, what is your advice on meditating when energy is low due to health issues? I feel that when energy is low, it's almost impossible to maintain attention on a specific object. Attention just bounces around and perception becomes drowsy. In these moments, I just go to Shikantaza and become aware of impermanence. I think your advice is to not meditate when we are very tired, except when we are at advanced stages. Then I think the advice is to meditate even in the midst of drowsiness. Can you expand on that? So yes, I'll begin with that. My advice is, especially when you are in the first seven, maybe I should say first 6 stages. If you are experienced profound tiredness that is interfering with your meditation, you're probably much wiser to rest or sleep and then try to meditate again when you are more alert, because the kinds of skills that you've developed for dealing with meditation, whereas in some cases they may be enough to allow you to effectively sustain a degree of mindfulness. For most people, they aren't, and that's why I recommend that if you're tired and you can't overcome the tiredness enough to have an effective meditation, then have a rest instead. But there are those times when, let's say, you're ill, or there's some other factor other than just simple lack of sleep, that is affecting the ability of your mind to remain focused. Well, the kind of thing that you mentioned, the shikantaza, is that would be a good way to approach that, or just to take a broad and more easily sustained focus of attention, like my preference in those situations. And I've spent a lot of time where illness and consequences of surgical or other kinds of treatments have left me in a place where my alertness was impaired, is that just being fully present in my body, using my attention that way, and at the same time trying to sustain as much mindfulness as I can, I found to be not only very effective as a way of still exercising those faculties of mind, but it also contributes greatly to the rest and the recovery of the body. I think the attention of the mind to the body has some effects that we don't really understand that well. And if you're doing that from a place of rest and not resisting the process that's taking place, then I think it actually assists the body in healing. So that's how I would respond to that. Now, something that happens, and I talk about in the 7th interlude of TMI, is that as we go along, our mindfulness takes on another dimension, whereas earlier we became more mindful and more alert, both, and increased the power, our overall conscious power, by converting non-perceiving mind moments into perceiving mind moments. And we reach a point where we've done that as much as we can. And of course, depending on the circumstances that we're in, like, for example, being ill as opposed to being in our prime mental and physical condition, there is at some point where we've gone as far as we can with that. There's another aspect to mindfulness that I don't address until later, and this is dependent upon unification of mind. And so that's why I don't bring it up until later. But we can have a very high level of unification of mind, even when there are many non-perceiving mind moments that are providing the content of consciousness. So there is this other way of being highly mindful, even when our innate capacity for alertness is impaired. And so that is what I recommend that you do to the degree that you're capable of. And I did mention earlier that some people in the first 6 stages, where you're primarily stages of skill development rather than in the adept stages where those skills have been pretty well mastered and there is sufficient unification. But it's worth a try. If you're a stage 4 or 5 or 6 meditator, you might see if you can sustain that kind of mindfulness. And if you can't, then just do as I said before. Does that answer that question for you? Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you. I apologize for the mask. I'm taking care of my mom. She's in respiratory isolation, so I have to wear this.
Yes, I hope she does well, whatever it is. And yes, we're all wearing masks, whether we realize it or not. Yours is just more obvious.
That's true. So if I understand correctly, there's a point, because I I do get a sense on the meditations and daily life of this union of awareness and the mind moment not being separate, so that's even, but that's when the energy is higher, it's easier to see. When the energy is low, it's kind of like the duality sort of gets more accentuated than when it's not. When there's more energy, it's sort of easy.
I'm sorry,
But I do notice a difference when there's less energy.
Yes, you are. But if you can think of this, and if you haven't, just go back and look at the 7th interlude and the things I say there. There's really 2 components to a conscious experience. There is the information that is being made available to be exchanged between the various unconscious parts of the mind. But the other component of that is the size of the audience that is tuning in to this information that is being presented. And so what the second kind of mindfulness I'm talking about is, and that depends on unification of mind, is increasing the audience for the content of consciousness, even when the content of consciousness itself is limited due to these other factors. So that's probably the best way of thinking of it. So there was, I just want to look at the rest of what you say here. The situation seems like it would be similar to the moments just prior to death. We're losing all control over consciousness as the brain physically breaks down. So as a related question, what is your advice on what to do at the moment of death? And I believe different traditions offer different advice. Well, first of all, I think that it's a very, very safe assumption that as the different parts of your brain shut down, that it is going to be not dissimilar to going to sleep or being drowsy or being ill or something like that. I've come very close too many times, but I haven't actually died. We do have descriptions of people who have come very close to having died. I disagree with the assertion that there is anybody who has ever died and come back, because they didn't die, but they were somewhere in the process and they came back. Some of them seem to describe a very high degree of lucidity, and some of this can be replicated in ordinary people as the brain becomes depleted of oxygen, that they will have these very lucid experiences similar to what are described as near-death experiences. So it's very difficult to say just what. And of course, there are many ways of dying, and dying as a result of a stroke is obviously going to be somewhat different than dying as a result of kidney failure or something like that. It's going to have different effects on the brain and things like that. In answer to your question, I think the best that any of us can do, and probably this is what is being reached for or pointed at in different traditions, is to sustain as high a degree of mindfulness as you can, probably primarily in that second sense of unification of mind. I think the more unified your mind is during the process of dissolution leading to death. Personally, when I die, I want to be as fully present for that experience as I can. And so that's what my recommendation would be.
Thank you.
And I just, another thought that I had, I have good reason to contemplate my own death and to plan the kinds of circumstances that might take place in. And I had a particular plan, and I'm thinking of revising it because I'm noticing in my day-to-day experiences an effect that having people that you are close to, that there's a lot of love involved in your relationship, it has an extremely beneficial effect on exactly the kind of clarity of mind that I'm talking about. I feel greater clarity when I'm in the presence of people that I love, that love me, that there's trust, that there's understanding. And so I think perhaps there's much to be said for the tradition of a death where you are surrounded by the people that are closest to you. I think it may make you far more present in that moment of death. Just my suggestions. You're asking questions that I can only hypothesize. So, but those are my thoughts, and I do appreciate your questions. So, and I hope your mask and your mother's respiratory condition is nothing that is approaching death, and that's involved in your question. But if it is, you have my sincerest best wishes for both your mother and all of you that will be staying behind.
Thank you. Thank you. It's not that serious, but
wonderful.
it
Okay.
will happen it will happen sometime. So thank you for your answer.
Yes, yes, it will happen sometime. So yes, but I'm glad it's not imminent. William, yes. So let's see. I've recently learned a technique to release negative emotional trace reactions, habits, and emotional reactions as they evolve, called dismissing, and coming from a non-dual tradition of inquiry. I've had great success in relieving severe back pain and abdominal pain and diarrhea using this method. Dismissing technique instructions: choose the emotion or emotional reaction to a situation you want to clear. Let yourself feel that emotion now. Locate the physical sensation on the central channel of the torso, the sushumna, I assume. A fist-sized tube running from neck to pelvis. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Connect deeply to the sensation of it there. Put all your attention there. Dismiss it. Apply your will and intention and say to it respectfully and with compassion, thank you, your job is completed. I no longer need you. You may release deeply. You can leave now, or like that. Eventually, one can release on any concentrated, discomfortable sensation felt in the core, and eventually any elsewhere in the body. There are many variations on it, such as dismissing sense of powerlessness, smallness, resistance, and reference to the I, me, or mine related to the emotion or situation. I was curious how you would understand the mechanism of how this might work within your TMI explanatory framework. Well, William, as I read this originally and as I reread it now, what I see in this is another application of the same principles that I've described in stage 4 for dealing with both physical pain and difficult emotional things that arise due to either past traumatic events or cumulative effects of different kinds of emotional and psychological trauma, ongoing trauma. So the similarities that I see immediately are the focus on the physical sensations and allowing that, allowing the acceptance of that in some form to allow you to do the same with the emotional component. And now, something that when I wrote the chapter on stage 4 that I hope that everyone would learn was the ability to dissociate the mind's resistance to physical pain, the Buddha's second arrow from the first arrow. And that when you succeed in doing that, there is a release and the pain may persist, but now it is perceived as just another physical sensation. Now, part of your description where it goes somewhat differently is the focus on the central energy canal in the body. And I don't dismiss that. It's an area that I haven't explored, but I feel this is a really valuable territory for exploration. All these energy phenomena that are dealt with in many different practices. So whereas I would recommend that you just explore and examine the pain and come to the place where basically a place of acceptance where you're no longer generating the second arrow of resistance, and then it becomes very tolerable. The one difference in your description here is the saying, you can go now. Well, if what you are letting go of is the second arrow, the mental resistance, then I would agree with that. And your severe back pain, I think that Shinzen's formula, where he uses the resistance as a multiplier of the physical pain, suffering equals pain times resistance, I think that is very, very accurate. And so I think that what you are left with is a physical sensation that is very tolerable. And I know this is how I experience pain regularly. I just allow it to be there. And sometimes it ceases even to arise into consciousness. Otherwise, other times it's there, but it's no longer a problem. So I'm totally in agreement with this description, especially as it pertains to physical pain and the pointer to using the energy system involving the nadis, the sushumna, and central channel. I think that is something. By no means do I dismiss that, but I do understand the "you can go now" as really referring primarily to Buddha's second arrow. When we apply this to emotions, you will probably have noticed that the way I treat difficult emotional situations that arise in meditation in a parallel fashion to pain. And the examples that you mentioned, they're very good examples. I probably should have specified maybe some of those particular examples when I wrote the book, because they're very good ones. There is really no kind of emotional response that doesn't manifest in the body, and the body then gives us access to it in a way that we can release it. And then the same thing is going to apply. Except in this case, it's a little more complex process than the physical pain and the second arrow of resistance, because as emotions arise, then there becomes this, the emotion gives rise to a story, and the story intensifies the emotion or even calls up other emotions. And then you get, then the story is modified in turn, and you end up with this cyclic increasing of intensity of the emotion and the associated discomfort. And so, of course, as with anything like that, we want to discover what the weak link in the cycle is and see how we can interrupt that. And if you can accept the physical component of an emotion, then you can move towards acceptance of emotion. And the storytelling and everything else is the mind's resistance to whatever has given rise to the emotion. It is not resistance to the emotion. That's one thing that I think is important, maybe just to clarify in this discussion, is that in this kind of positive feedback cycle of emotion storytelling, the stories are actually reinforcing the emotion, and emotion is reinforcing and guiding the storytelling process. But it's whatever has given rise to the emotion that's what needs to be released. And so that's what we're working towards. But by starting with the physical sensations associated with the emotions, this is our entryway into the psychological component. And to the degree that we can begin to release the mentally perceived aspect of the emotions. And by the way, what you experience in this is that the stories begin to lose their power and as well. Then you will wind this down. So the method that you're describing, short answer, I know I'm prone to long answers, but the short answer is, sounds like a really good one. You're onto something here. And I like the fact that that it points to the fact that perhaps working with energy systems and some of the traditions that use these energy systems might give us access to a much more powerful version of the same process. Did I succeed in addressing? Yeah. Oh, there's a problem with this sound. You're in chipmunk mode. You do a good chipmunk. No, it's still.
If you want to dismiss
What's that?
if you want to dismiss emotions.
Well, that's the same. Yeah, perhaps should mention that. The same thing as dismissing the pain. We don't want to dismiss the pain. We want to dismiss the reaction.
The formulation of the question.
Hear me now?
As if he's disowning the emotions.
Yes. Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Wonderful. Yes.
Well, I mean, you came up with very many interesting explanatory analogies or descriptions of how it parallels with TMI,
Mm-hmm.
the processes as you described them in TMI. the thing that I found interesting was that the fact that these releases would occur so quickly with this, such that just in a couple days, I had incredible changes in pain relief. This is, I guess I haven't had really much in the way of stories going on. And the interesting other thing was that it was became possible that during daily life, as the emotions arose, or as actually it would even be just as the physical sensations of a certain discomfort in that core region rose, one could concentrate just on the physical sensations without knowing what else was going on and just dismiss them.
Yes, yes. Well, as far as how quickly this happens, the more you come, I think a prerequisite to this is to be able to clearly perceive the mind's resistance to physical pain as it arises. And you will have the experience over time, whereas just as you, when you're practicing meditation, you only sort of realize after the fact that a distraction had arisen and your mind had set it aside. You come to a place where you never really, your mind deals with the pain, not within a couple of days, but it's quite understandable. You're developing a skill. You'll come to a point where the pain is, basically that second arrow isn't generated. Now, Dor Conferty is sitting here next to me, and while you were adjusting your sound, he raised something I think is very important. He said, so why would you want to dismiss the emotion? And it's a very good point, because it's not that you want to, and this is where, as with the discussion of pain, there's a little bit difference between the way my perspective on this differs a little bit from the description where they use the term dismiss. But I suspect if we were to talk to someone who was much more deeply knowledgeable about the system, we might find that we're really talking about a lot of the same things. Just as you're not really dismissing the physical pain, you're dismissing the mind's inappropriate reaction to it. The same thing with an emotion. And this is why the cause of the emotion is so important, is that what you're wanting to interrupt in an emotional process is the mind's inappropriate reaction to it. That cyclic intensification of emotion, and it goes beyond intensification. It also brings up other emotions, and you end up, one overlays another, and they become entwined with each other. And so you get this mixture of emotions that becomes more and more difficult to sort out. But what you want to do is dismiss the process, and whatever it is that gave rise to the emotion, if you can get to the place of you're basically able to, I don't want to use the word confront, interact with the emotion as using your emotional intelligence to understand what has given rise to the emotion. What is that emotion trying to tell you? So what you want to dismiss is the mind's inappropriate reaction to the emotion, which is going to blind you to what its sources are and really to any appropriate way of dealing with it. So what you're wanting to dismiss is this cyclic intensification of it. When this manifests as a purification in meditation, that's exactly what you're doing. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, when you come to the place where the unpleasantness of the experience and the negative emotional content seems to fade and no longer be important. And if you have been able to be consciously in contact with whatever the origins of that feeling were, then what happens is they take on a clarity. Understanding comes. If it's something that involves something that someone has done to you, then there is understanding and forgiveness and compassion that replaces the anger or the resentment or the depression or the sense of personal inadequacy or whatever it is that your mind system has generated in response to that. Likewise, if it's something you have done, you can see and understand and forgive yourself in turn. And so all of these complex emotional consequences that have arisen out of it then become accessible, and we're not to be dismissed, but to take advantage of I really like the term emotional intelligence. I've never read any of the books or anything about it, so I don't know if they're really talking about the same thing that I am. But there is, the emotional system came into being as a kind of intelligence that preceded what we now refer to as intelligence in terms of our capacities for analytic and reductionistic approaches to problem solving and things like that. So the intelligence of the emotional mind is is a very important part of understanding ourselves. And so as Dora mentioned, yes, you don't want to dismiss the emotion. You want to come to a place where you can learn what it has been trying to tell you. And it speaks a much more primitive language, but you can open up to it. You can learn the lesson. You can resolve to a greater, just as you can resolve the second arrow of the pain, you can resolve the ongoing emotional reaction to past or current trauma. I've had lots of experience with the latter myself recently, so I'm pretty good at talking about that.
Well, the interesting thing has been that as I would be, say, involved in a situation, say watching a movie or something like that,
yes,
and I would find an emotional reaction coming up with regard to what's going on, or say with regard to anything, and I could feel it rising and be able to dismiss the habitual reaction to a situation, or I would say the resistance to that situation.
Yes.
Very quickly. And that's even without necessarily identifying it as an emotional reaction. I'm thinking of it mainly as being like habitual reactions that we learn to respond to prior situations that are coming up again, and dismissing that kind of a habit. And sort of
exactly.
Associating when you think of the brain as having a dual pathway, where the cognitive part is going on, and then the part that goes through the amygdala gets the emotional charge. And I was thinking that maybe this technique sort of dissociates those two to sort of integrate and not continue the reaction to.
You put that very well. That's what I was trying to say earlier about the disentanglement. Because first you have to disentangle before you can integrate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so yes, so you put it very well. Yes.
I do think it's worth relying on one thing, and I'll ask a question. Do you conflate the emotional reaction with resistance?
In this situation, I do, because it's reactions to things that happen outside, or
Right.
reactions even to something internal. If I'm thinking something, and again, something strong arises, you can catch it really early, again, without the story.
Yes.
And it just dissolves away. And I mean, I didn't understand it. I don't really know. It's just surprising to me how powerful and quick that it was.
The reason I'm asking is that what I've noticed is that in a situation like that, when there's a habitual emotional response, the emotion itself isn't the resistance to the situation, but rather the resistance is the resistance to feeling the emotion. We have an idea about what sort of emotion we should or shouldn't be feeling. In your example, you mentioned emotions that normally in Western society are construed as negative, like smallness and helplessness. And then the resistance isn't in feeling helplessness towards the situation, but we're actually resisting feeling small. We've been taught that being small is bad. And this path is not about dismissing or even letting go or releasing emotion, so to speak. It's letting go or learning to accept and love any type of emotion, any type of expression that comes up. How's that sound to you?
I'm not, in that sense, I wouldn't say that I'm trying to fight the emotion. I mean, I don't see that way. As a matter of fact, I mean, in some ways, I think that our discussion sort of gets complicated because we're dealing with concepts. And for me, it's just straight physical experience. Oftentimes, I don't even feel an emotion before this resistance or this whatever it is. I'd let it go.
Well, that is good, but it also is it can become a sort of, depending on the emotion and the situation, it can also constitute a kind of bypassing, so that you never really engage the emotion to understand what it's trying to tell you. And like a feeling of helplessness. Yes, we resist a feeling of helplessness, and we will convert it into other emotional things that make us feel more comfortable, or we'll tell stories that will help us make us feel more comfortable. That's a way of avoidance. But so would be training yourself to let it go without ever, feeling it, understanding it, and learning from it, and using the word that you used, integrating it. Once the integration of the source of the emotion has occurred, then that emotion no longer is necessary. It's done its job, so to speak. And so now it doesn't need to be there anymore, or to arise in those habitual situations.
Another interesting side effect is that as a result of this, many sort of memories of emotional situations would arise from the past. And these are things that I hadn't ever, remembered or thought about. But again, it is going back to that. And indeed, that is uncovering as part of this process. The idea of dismissing on helplessness or smallness is not the reaction to the smallness, but when people have an idea or a concept that they're small in relationship to an emotion that is overpowering.
Yeah.
So in other words, that idea is learning to release that resistance to the emotion.
Yes.
To be able to get to the emotion.
Yes.
So that's where, I mean, I guess I don't think that I'm resisting the emotions.
Mhm.
They come. I mean, I don't have any control over my emotions.
Right.
They just fucking come.
It's what happens next, and
Right,
often
right.
You don't have any control over what happens next too.
Right.
But it's being in that place, at the very least having a method to apply, but at best having an understanding of the process that's going on, and to be able to deal with it wisely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it's wonderful. Thank you for introducing us to this idea and to this discussion, because it makes a really nice expansion on opportunity to expand on very, very important aspects of stage 4. As a matter of fact, if there's ever a second edition of TMI, which Dor has offered to help write, we may devote another interlude or chapter to discussing this in depth, because it is of such enormously great value and importance. Maybe we'll consult with you too. Yeah, thanks. Okay, well, let's move on then to Bert Elsey. Oops. Is Bert here? Don't see Bert. Okay, let's see. I'll come back to Bert. Manuel?
Yes, hello.
Hello, Manuel. Yes, I see you.
Welcome back.
well, and it's good to see you. Welcome back to you as well. You wrote a while ago that you are experimenting with the Wim Hof method. You tested it yourself for about 4 weeks, and you're wondering what my experiences and thoughts about it are, and if you would recommend it. Well, you've had, first I have to say that you've had more experience with it than I have personally. I started using it, just the breathing techniques. I didn't get as far as the cold showers or the hand in the bucket of cold water or any of those kinds of things. And I only did a few days of the breathing techniques, but I was extremely impressed. And I have regular conversations with a very good friend who has been doing this quite intently. We can see a lot of parallels between what Wim Hof is doing and the Tibetan practice of Tumo when it comes to dealing with cold. So I'm very intrigued by this. I have the intention of following through on it. I practiced it for a few days and then began to use my practice time in different ways that seemed more appropriate for my current situation. I'm looking forward to being able to go into the Wim Hof method. So as a matter of fact, for those of you who are interested, I'm going to put his name in the chat. Also, there's a book. It's somebody who did the
privately.
Oh.
To change
Oh, sorry. I'm writing privately, and that's not good. Everyone. Okay, I'll put that in again. The man's name whose method we're talking about. And then the name of a book that I haven't read yet. Someone who did the training with him, and so you get to, as I understand it, the book is about his experience with the training from a first-person perspective. At least that's what it sounds like from what the Amazon blurb said, and I'm hoping that's what it is. It's a bet. Okay, so.
Would you say the briefing method is the most important part of the
You know, at this point, Manuel, I can't say. How far along are you in the practice? What?
I only did the first 2 or 3 weeks and then lost interest. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So if you lost interest, that would suggest that you didn't. You weren't getting results that were sufficiently motivating to
I didn't know if the effects on my body with the breathing and the cold shower to my bladder and stuff like this is really that efficient. But
yeah. I haven't gotten to that part of the practice. For those of you that have never heard of Wim Hof, parts of the practice are initially extremely difficult. My friend who's done it said that that they quickly stop being so difficult and actually become more satisfying, even enjoyable. But the things like you're taking a hot shower and then you switch to freezing cold water for 2 minutes, things like that. And then there's other practices that involve holding your hand in a bucket with a mixture of ice and water that is obviously right around the freezing point, and doing this for progressively longer periods of time. All of this is in combination with various breathing exercises that precede and are concurrent with and follow these things that involve dealing with cold. But as I say, it's very, very similar in many ways to the Tibetan Tummo practices that you may have heard about, where Tibetan monks go out and sit on a snowdrift and have a contest, see who can melt the deepest hole, and things like that. It involves control over the autonomic nervous system, and what it promises is that this can allow a person to deal far more effectively personally with various disease processes and improve their health in general by gaining control over autonomic processes. So I'm a long way from being able to say too much about this, although Manuel, I do intend to follow it up, and if you go any further with it, you might want to just let me know what your experience is, and we can kind of share notes, exchange.
Maybe I'll start again. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay. I think there's a whole bunch of things in the chat that I've looked at. I wonder. One from Michelle asking to address her question today, if we can. That looks like the most important one. And a question from Harpreet about Mahamudra. Okay, so I'm glad that I noticed those. I'm glad I went to the chat. Let's see. Nathan Hershey, and this is the last of the questions intended for today. Let's see. Nathan, are you here today?
Yes.
Oh,
hello,
wonderful.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Very well. Very well. Okay, let's see. Yes, we've answered this question. Do you think math and science can help the modern world to fully adopt the Dharmic worldview? How might fully awakened beings, assuming they can acquire the relevant skills, use the precise language of mathematics and the systematic processes used in science and engineering to facilitate our society in adopting a precise and systematic education system that might have the chance of being able to facilitate the most optimal integration of the Dhamma on a global scale? For the sake of adding context to this question, I personally grew up with no spiritual views or views relating to suffering and the end of suffering, unity, suchness, etc., but held a very high esteem for the scientific processes. So when I watched the cognitive psychologist Donald Hoffman, Do We See Reality as It Is? Yes, I've heard of him. I'm familiar with his work, and I think very highly of what he's doing. I do see some problems with it, but that's, yeah. But basically, I love his work and his presentations, and they're right on. But you watched and discovered his conclusions, arriving at using math, science, and computational models of evolutionary game theory, in fact, accorded with the perspective on consciousness and the illusory, mentally fabricated nature of experience that I directly experienced myself as a result of practicing the Dharma. As an aside, I wonder why it was that mathematics was able to arrive at such profound conclusions as well. You and Pythagoras and a whole lot of us since as well. I couldn't help but wonder if this gateway to the Dharma could be designed in a systematic way and be used to help spread the Dharma in our modern age. That's a really interesting thing that you brought up, Nathan. And yes, so one of my projects is to present the truths of the Buddha Dharma, what the Buddha taught. You know, what the Buddha really taught, devoid of these other accretions, and present them in such a way that they become more or less self-evident through a combination of closely examining our personal experience, through applying rational thought, and through drawing, in particular, drawing on the knowledge that that science and mathematics and systems theory in particular provide us with. As a matter of fact, how I will develop this, I found in writing a chapter on the Four Noble Truths, and the first Noble Truth in particular, that the best way that I found of expressing that, and right now it needs simplification for a broader audience, but was through systems theory. So I agree with you totally. The Pythagoreans and many people, including, and this includes many physicists and mathematicians, have been really struck by the way that, I mean, Pythagoras went so far as to posit that the nature of the universe was ultimately mathematical. And the other way of looking at it is that mathematics is a way that the human mind can use its tendencies to actually gain a much deeper understanding of reality than our ordinary ability to conceptualize allows us to do. So for those who've gotten deeply into certain aspects of mathematical physics, we find that mathematics is revealing things about the nature of reality that no matter how hard our minds are not able to conceptualize. And a simple one that probably most of you at one time or another have attempted to deal with is the equivalence of the four dimensions, whereas we perceive three as equivalent and one as distinct as time. And and that's something that mathematically is very easy to deal with. And the equivalence of those would allow any one to function as time. But that remains something that, you know, we can't generate a mental image of. Much of quantum physics and things like that defies what our usual way of thinking, the way our usual way of thinking constrains our ability to understand. But the deeper that one goes into these things from the point of using mathematics to go deeply into physics, you enter into realms where something is just brilliantly clear from a mathematical point of view, but remains totally in the mind cannot generate imagery or conceptual constructs that it can grasp that correspond to this, and yet these are based on real events that we can see, that we can perceive. It's just that when we apply mathematics to the analysis of them, it takes us into a realm that is beyond that. Now, what your real question is can this be an aid to understanding the Dharma? And I think what I've seen, first of all, is that for example, in philosophy, I would say, although there's still a lot of debate and back and forth, in philosophy and also in cognitive science, the idea of no self, even though it's an intellectual concept rather than an experience, something that's known experientially, is beginning to be the norm. You know, and there's a number of very prominent philosophers who've written extensively on the on this idea of the imaginary nature of the self. And Mark, feel free to comment on what's happening in the realms of cognitive psychology and the same thing, if you wish. But these are all pointing to, I mean, basically the reason that I feel like I can write the book that I'm working on is that there's nothing about the Dharma, about the fundamental truths that we know through the Dharma and through our practices that can't at least be intellectually understood and recognized as being valid, and our normal way of viewing things as being not only invalid or less valid, but actually harmful and destructive as compared to these more accurate ways of perceiving reality. So Nathan, I'm totally with you on this. My vision for the future is less one where we're trying to teach children in grade school science and math, rather than we have children growing up in a society. And so from the time that they begin to assimilate a worldview from their parents and caretakers, that the worldview that they're assimilating is one that reflects the truths of the Dharma, of the interconnectedness of everything, of everything as process, that there are no things, the emptiness of our mental formations, that the sense of self is just a very useful, evolutionarily very useful thing, but it's really kind of like an appendix in the awakened human mind that plays no functional role anymore, because it is empty, because there is only this process, and because absolutely everything is interconnected. And the idea that there is any individual I who is either experiencing or acting independently of the rest is an illusion. So all of this is available, and I feel like all of this can be communicated and can be can be understood and appreciated. And of course, all of this in the book I'm hoping to write is a hook to then say, well, now the problem is, how do we go from thinking the way we do to thinking in this obviously, in this clearly more accurate way about ourselves and reality and our relationship to the rest of what is. And so then I say, well, guess what? There are ways to do this, and I also want to include in that all of the people who are experimenting with augmenting the traditional methods with the use of various technologies like Jay Sanguinetti with his deep brain ultrasound stimulation, the work that's being done in many laboratories, people who are experimenting with using various psychoactive substances to augment meditative processes and things like that. So if I can convince people that, yeah, things really are in this, not the way that we usually think of them and the way we culturally assume them to be, but they are this other way, and it's quite understandable, and it's quite obvious that this is really the truth. How do I change myself from perceiving things in this old and inadequate way, and instead perceiving them in this much better way, and then say, there is hope. There are ways, and there are people who are busy working on refining those ways. That perhaps at one time the basic methods were far more successful, if we can believe the things that it said about what the Buddha was able to accomplish with very large numbers of people. How that somehow has been lost, but all of the people like myself who are trying to understand meditation from a different point of view, bring a modern perspective to that. What we're trying to do really underneath it all is to get back to, or if the other is a myth, then come to a place where we have much more powerful tools to work with. And if we can augment that with various kinds of brain stimulation, be it physical or chemical, so much the better. If those turn out to be nothing more than ways of understanding more deeply what the changes are that take place as the mind becomes awakened, that can only help us to find better ways to do it as well. So
I guess I wanted to comment on a specific thing that you said is the other side of it. I was thinking more of using mathematics and science as kind of as more of a method of, well, how do we study, for example, with how big data is being gathered from social networks, and our widespread use of technology is just continuing to become more and more intimate with like human lives on a global scale, and this is generating massive amounts of data, which is then kind of illuminating the behaviors and the patterns of social networks, and then to use math and science to then study that, to then kind of how certain messages and certain teachings are starting to be individualized by learning, say, how a mind system, by collecting data, how do they process reality, how do they assimilate certain teachings, and then use that as kind of a method of, well, say we have the Dharma, we have the solution is like a medicine, and then to understand, to create a program like a systematic education system that could then study how we learn anything, and then to apply that in certain teaching methods, which could be on like not just an individual but like a social learning scale. With MIT has social physics, they call it, where they're studying like how cities behave and how just locations where things are located in the city, they can predict, like, say, how productive a city is. And or like social learning, they find that actually by, you know, getting people's friends to like exercise and then giving them incentives if they can get their friends to exercise, that's like things along those lines.
That's absolutely brilliant. Now, as you say this, I realize that, yes, I've had similar thoughts at times, that it's not something that I've pursued, but it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, essentially, what I hear you pointing us towards is that that we should be dealing not only with the individual mind, but with the collective mind, the group mind, and from that can allow us to deal more effectively with individual differences. But the whole other dimension that it raises is rather than being a society of awakened individuals, what if there was a collective awakening, so that both awakened and unawakened individuals were part of a society which was awakened. So, you know, it's kind of like the situation of somebody in one of the lower paths where part of their mind is still unawakened, and but because they've crossed that threshold, enough of the mind is awakened, enough of all of the subminds making up the mind system are awakened, that they will bring the unawakened subminds along with them. And
Yes.
now you're talking about children being born into that kind of awakened society. A very exciting thought. Brilliant. I love it. I mean, gosh, I wish I was your age or 20 years old or something and could start off developing that.
Well, you can help. You actually can, because you're me, so you can help me.
Yes, I will. Yes, we're you know, yeah, we're all in this together.
Worth mentioning that this is one of the holy grails that the consciousness hacking community is working on, if you're familiar with that.
Only in that you say, kind of like saying hacking conscious networks is very in the same vein of how I'm kind of thinking. Is there like a code, you know, like if we view everything just as one network, there's an entire network.
Yeah.
And so there's this code of the Dharma, and then there's this unawakened code, okay? So forget about individuals, forget about, you know, it's just a network and of mind systems on different scales. And so could you write a code and then reprogram the whole system, you know, that hacking.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what consciousness hacking is. Yeah. So, yes, wonderful ideas. Wonderful ideas. So, I was invited to attend several different consciousness hacking meetings that were taking place sequentially in California, and I was too ill to attend, and I've always regretted that. I'd love to, yeah. I'm looking to a future where maybe I have a little more free time to do some of those things. And one of the things that I really want to do is to get to know a little better the whole consciousness hacking scene. And I've got the right man for that sitting next to me. So
well, that's where mathematics seems to provide a language of some sort in that picture.
Mathematics and cybernetics, yes.
Yes.
So thanks. That was a really wonderful thing to get into. So now Michelle had a question posted for, and I know there was a couple of people's questions that we missed here today. Paula, and I hope you could make a note of those, because you know how notoriously short-term my memory is. Of the questions that we didn't answer. So before we go, I'm going to go to Mundy's question and find Michelle's, since she specifically asked that I address it today. This is
It's the top.
it at the top? Oh, there it is. Yes, here it is. So, Michelle, you say, recently I had the insight that stillness gives way to silence, not through the absence of sound, but rather as one is unmoved by change. Acutely aware of the ever-presence of change, which has given rise to fear, there is the knowing that what there is to let go of is essentially nothing, just thoughts that create separateness, and the idea that a me exists, and what there is to surrender to is becoming everything. I would appreciate any suggestions that you might have as a way to work with this in sits. Currently, I stay completely present to whatever is arising and just watch it until it passes. So,
things have also changed since then.
oh, okay.
Yeah, where that was about 5 days ago. And then I started to explore this thing we call everything, and really got to the place where that's totally empty. So I'm pretty essentially making something out of nothing. And since then, I have this experience in my sits where I've gone from floating to flying.
Mm-hmm.
And now when I sit, everything is completely still. There are no thoughts whatsoever. And I feel as though like there's a strong electromagnetic sensation and that the physical body is being lifted.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of bright light. And yeah, I'm not sure where to go from here.
Oh, well, that's to translate it into your everyday experience, not sitting on the cushion, or
Yep,
before you get to that place when you're sitting on the cushion and you're still you're still not recognizing the emptiness of the mental formations that arise and the emptiness of the mind that is giving rise to them. So
yeah,
that's what you do with it.
That's actually what's been happening without even putting any effort in.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
just how things show up. And I guess there was a place where I was wondering if when nothing's coming up, that everything is that still. If there's anything that should be looked at as far as an insight practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know how much has changed since you wrote your question, but there are a lot of, or there are a number of conceptualizations inherent in the question that you wrote that would be the kind of thing that you would like to put into this larger perspective that you're now describing.
Yeah.
And so to the degree that you can identify what your mind is going to want to do is to cling to very subtle fabrications that appear to fulfill what you have seen and understood.
Right.
So what you want to do is to recognize those.
Okay.
So that it's like it's cleaning the windshield a little bit more. You know, there's still a few smashed bugs on the windshield, and so you want to clean those up. And the thing that I just want to make sure that that you understand is that a mistake that has been made too many times in the history of Buddhism is that the ultimate goal is something that is essentially nihilistic in a way. It's just a total negation of everything. And that's only a preliminary step. That's just as I was talking to Dora last night at dinner, that's clearing the table so that you have an opportunity to understand something greater. And so don't mistake the negation, the nothingness, for the end of the process.
Well, I'm clear, I'm not done.
To put it in these kinds of terms, there are two views in Tibetan Buddhism, the Rangtong and the Shentong. The Rangtong insists that ultimate reality is empty of self-nature, and the Shentong, which is to me so obviously the more accurate explanation, is that ultimate reality, ultimate truth is empty of other nature, but not, it is the only thing that is not empty of self-nature. It is what it is.
Yes.
Suchness is a description of that.
Yes.
Suchness is just suchness.
Yeah.
And it is not empty of self-nature, but it is empty of other nature. Everything else is empty of self-nature.
Okay.
Okay?
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm glad we were able to get your question dealt with. I think,
what's your advice for her for practice?
I would my tendency would be to want to give you some really pragmatic advice, in which case I'd have to ask a little bit more detail of what you're actually experiencing. Do you have something to suggest, Dora, that maybe doesn't require going into this more deeply?
What I know, what I like doing in these very deep shamatha states, where the tendency is to just relax into the pleasant sensations and the peace, is to use it for the purpose for which it's been cultivated, which is as a launching pad into something deeper,
Yeah.
right? This is like a perfect state for inviting myself into opening up to more conflicts, to more and more subtle levels of perception. And a great way of doing that is through inquiry, to asking myself questions like, what's missing?
Yes. Yes.
What's preventing me from waking up right now?
Okay.
Right, what's in the way? And then anything that's unsatisfied is this way invited into showing its pain, invited into telling you about the conflict that's still there in subtle levels.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Oh, great! I'm glad, and thank you, Dora. You know, and I am so thankful that there are these people who can put things succinctly and directly, because as you know, inevitably, I want to get into all of the details and connect it all together and everything like that. So wonderful. Thank you, Dora.
Yeah, thank you.
And I hope this has been an enjoyable and productive session for all of you. And thank you for joining me this morning. Well, morning, evening, whatever time it is where you are. But, and I look forward to our next session, and we'll get the recording of this posted as soon as we can. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Until next time, perhaps some of you I'll see you again tomorrow.